What is mythology? Well, mythology can be defined in a ton of different ways depending on who you ask. Google defines mythology as a traditional story, especially one concerning the early history of a people or explaining some natural or social phenomenon, and typically involving supernatural beings or events. I've also heard more abstract definitions of mythology, such as myths are describing unknown things in the terms of things that we know. And although I think this definition is a little bit better, it's still not sufficient. So the first half of today's video is going to be focusing on pinpointing a definition of mythology, a workable definition that we can then build on in the second half of the video and ask bigger questions like what is the purpose of mythology and what's the function of it for us as organisms. So the first issue we run into is defining what mythology is and kind of categorizing it. So many brilliant thinkers would say that the closest cousin of mythology is not history, it's not narrative, and it's not religion, but instead the closest thing we can get to mythology is actually psychology. So how do they come to this conclusion that mythology is most closely related to psychology? First, mythology is a universal characteristic of humanity. There's not been one civilization found where mythological motifs were not at one point rehearsed. This would obviously suggest that myths are not just narratives and stories that flow from civilization to civilization, but they're something that we can't avoid, something that's built into who we are, something that is essentially inseparable from what it means to be a human. Carl Jung called this the collective unconscious or the primary image. Joseph Campbell, in Volume 1 of his work on primitive mythologies, he mentions a hawk and a chick to help us better understand this concept. So chicks without prior experience of hawks or other birds of prey will run and flee when they see one overhead, which makes sense. So even in a more controlled scientific setting where these chicks are isolated, you fly a hawk overhead, they will still run for cover, meaning that their response did not come from obviously imitation, but it was something innate, something they had built into who they are. Furthermore, if the hawk is changed, such as the proportions of the wings, or if it's flipped around and flown backwards, the chick will not flee. It can recognize subtle differences like that. So this is mentioned as a parallel to humanity. Just like the little chick, we have certain built-in innate knowledge that we carry around with us no matter who we are, no matter where we are. And Carl Jung, guys like Joseph Campbell, Jordan Peterson, believe that mythology is the key to understanding where this knowledge came from and what it is. So this brings us to another question. How can fundamental knowledge be ingrained at a subconscious level without us ever knowing it? So it all begins at the subconscious mind. The subconscious mind lays the foundation for the conscious mind, and it's really the one running the show. Guys like Daniel Kahneman, through their extensive research, have proven this to be a fact. So the subconscious mind, then you have the conscious mind on top. These two influence our actions or our actual physical behavior. This physical behavior and our actions have biological implications, specifically evolutionary implications. If an action that we are involved in and that we repeatedly do is not advantageous and it's not beneficial, then it's weeded out by evolution. On the other hand, if that action is beneficial, then it's reinforced through evolution. But as you can see in my chart, or in my little diagram, what's reinforced is the action, not the conscious belief, not the subconscious belief that inform that action. And so an action can continue down an evolutionary line where the subconscious and conscious reasoning behind that action is actually lost. So let's go through a hypothetical example. So take a female human from hundreds of thousands of years ago. And in this point in biological evolution, let's just suppose that the mother has no attachment to the child. It doesn't really care about it. And let's say the human species is beginning to enter into an ice age. A climate ice age, it's going to be really cold, and as a result, children are dying at a much higher rate. So one of the mothers makes the conscious decision to care and love for the child no matter what happens, no matter how gross and stinky and loud the child is, she's going to care for it. This shift in mindset guides her action. So she has a change in mind, which guides her physical behavior and therefore increases the survivability of her children and her genes. So my theory would suggest that the behavior of caring for the child is then reinforced, not the belief. So the subconscious and conscious beliefs fade away. The reason why she did it in the first place was to increase the survivability. That completely fades away in subsequent generations. But what stays is the action, and the action stays as an innate behavior. And so that behavior is now ingrained as a chemical reaction instead of a conscious decision. And of course, this is a hypothetical scenario, but it gives kind of a working example of what I'm trying to say. It's pretty crazy to think that a conscious decision made thousands of years ago has the ability to permanently change a lineage of organisms forever. I also want to highlight one reason why this would be extremely helpful. So our conscious mind goes out and is making these kind of game time decisions. It's occupied. It's using a lot of our energy. If we can put those decisions and make them more streamlined and more automatic by putting them in the subconscious mind, we can free up our conscious mind to make more and new game time decisions to continually improve on humanity. We see this exact same thing in the way that we run our societies. People build on the people that are behind them. So what is mythology? In light of the information that we just covered, which was dense, I've come up with two characteristics that are fundamental in the definition of mythology. One is creative expression. The second is innate knowledge, which we just covered. So let's talk a little bit more about creative expression. As humans, we share many different features with millions of different organisms, such as our ability to perceive with our senses and construct this reality that we can survive in. As humans, we also have a mind or a consciousness that helps us make decisions and kind of organize all this information. But something that's super unique to humanity and definitely most developed in humans specifically is our creativity. One could argue that creativity is the most important aspect of humanity. It enables us to solve so many different problems. It enables us to innovate and construct stable societies. So with this in mind, it makes sense that from an evolutionary perspective, anything that promotes creativity is going to be preserved. It also makes sense that this characteristic would be an extremely powerful stimulus for humans. So take one of our more primitive abilities, such as our sense of taste, something we share with a lot of other organisms. A delicious taste can have a visceral effect on us, even releasing dopamine and making us addicted to it. It has an effect that's much deeper than just our taste buds. So imagine what the effect of creative expression can have on the human mind. And this can be in the form of paintings or sculptures or narratives that we see in mythology. So this leads us to the final part of this video. What is the purpose, what is the function of mythology in the life of a human? So in order to understand this, we need to cover just a little bit more science. In psychology, there's a concept known as an innate releasing mechanism. In simple terms, this is when a stimulus produces a specific reaction every single time. One example is a baby bird and its mother's beak. When the mother flies up, the baby bird perceives the beak, and therefore the innate response is to open its mouth for food. The mother's beak in this scenario is a means of releasing the baby bird's innate behavior of opening its mouth for food. So here's another example of innate releasing mechanisms. In this picture, we have 4 different organisms, and we have the baby versions and the adult versions. And for whatever reason, and you can ask just about any person, they will feel more attached and more interested in the organisms on the left. The shape of the animals on the left sparks an innate behavior to be more attracted to it. Obviously, this would be for care because we can tell that the organisms on the left are babies. So this finally leads us to the answer to the question we've been chasing. What is the purpose of mythology? One possibility is that mythology is a method for releasing certain advantageous behaviors that were previously programmed at a subconscious level by past generations. So remember that an innate behavior begins as a conscious idea. The conscious idea eventually fades, and the action, if it's advantageous, is reinforced, and that's all that remains. Then, in certain scenarios, an innate releasing mechanism is required to pull that action back out of our psyche. So maybe the innate releasing mechanism for morality, for selflessness, for purpose in life is actually mythology. Perhaps the narrative of Jesus produces an involuntary feeling of belonging and a feeling to love one another. Feelings that cannot be explained at the conscious level, but are instead induced subconsciously by the character of Jesus himself. Perhaps a desire to create and leave a positive impact on humanity can be induced by the narrative of Gilgamesh, which also emphasizes respect and friendship. Perhaps these myths we interact with on a daily basis, that ground our conversations, that ground our governments and our institutions, maybe these mythologies are not supposed to be taken literally, and their sole purpose is to keep us acting in ways that advance humanity. Maybe there is no reward for acting righteous, except to preserve our species. Maybe there is no reward for praying every single day, except to remind us of the actions and behaviors that will help our genes get passed on. And maybe your subconscious mind knows this better than you do and will never let you fully become detached from mythology, from religion, from spirituality, and thus from humanity.